Hello and welcome to Dig School, cross-curricular learning themed around archaeology. This session is Dumps the Dig, where we'll be looking at how the things that people throw away can become our most valuable finds. We'll be exploring how left behind stuff can tell us about people's lives and things that happened. We're finding out how we know and how this evidence is unique. First though, look at where this evidence comes from. So have a look at these 7 pots and put them into date order with the oldest first. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, so how did you get on with that? I expect some of them might have looked quite easy and obvious and others might have been a bit trickier. So these are the correct answers. You can see the pots in their date order here, from the earliest prehistoric ones through to the Roman period, the Anglo-Saxon period, then the medieval, then the post-medieval, then the Victorian period, and then the contemporary period. How many of those did you get right? Well done if you got quite a few of them right. Some of them are a bit tricky. What makes this whole thing even more tricky, of course, is we don't tend to find whole vessels like this in our archaeological rubbish. What we find is the small fragments of bits of them. They tend to look more like this. That's much more difficult to make sense of. But it's important to hold in your mind what these little pieces look like when we're looking at archaeological assemblages. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Later in Dig School, you will be digging yourself if you want to. So this is to give you a chance to develop the skills you'll need in paying attention to detail, creative thinking, and interpreting evidence. So first, have a really careful look at the collections of rubbish that I'm going to show you pictures of. And then write down on page 2 of your workbook everything you can infer about the people whose rubbish these collections are. So I'll show you the slide of each one, stop the film, write down everything that you can see, and also think about some key questions. How much time do you think the rubbish represents? How many people do you think were in the household? What gender are the people? What age are they? What sort of people are they? What are the relationships between the individuals? Are they parents and children, or friends, or something else? What's the household income? Is it high or middle or low? What sort of hobbies and interests and concerns do the people in that household have? And what can we tell about their diet, their meals, and their lifestyle? And also think about what might be missing. What can you not tell from this collection of rubbish that you might like to know to help make your picture of these people and their household and their lives more complete? So here goes, first picture. Okay, you've had a few minutes to have a look at that one. So now it's another picture. And there's another one. And now the fourth picture. And a fifth one. And now a sixth. Okay, so you've had a bit of a time to have a look at those. So I'll just skip back through those pictures and go through them. So there's a lot of rubbish in this one. Looks like several days worth of rubbish here. What can you tell from it? Well, you can see it's a household where they read. There's a envelope for some books that have been delivered. You can see looks like there's a male and a female there. There's some men's shampoo and some shampoo in a pink bottle, which is probably a female's. There's a Sensodyne toothpaste. There's some minerals and vitamins there, sort of calcium for joints. All showing signs of wanting to look after their body perhaps. There's evidence of a quite mixed diet. There's cheese, there's vegetables, there's potatoes there. You can see quite a general mixed diet, some tea bag packet there, tin tomatoes. So it looks like a reasonably healthy diet with a few treats, some Mr. Kipling apple pies there. Stock pot, that suggests again that they're cooking from fresh ingredients. There's a little bit of makeup at the top there, a flower pot, into gardening perhaps. And just at the very bottom on the right hand side, you might have noticed a couple of disposable contact lens containers. And of course, there's a packet of cat food. And perhaps the strange item is the tin of Spam there, because this is a household of two people in their late 50s whose children have left home. They have a cat. They eat a reasonably healthy diet. They are concerned to look after their health at the age when things start to get a bit creaky. And actually, the Spam is a meal that was made when one of their elderly mothers came to visit. And that's a sort of nostalgic meal, Spam, from the sort of wartime post-war era. So you've got a bit of a picture of that household from that collection of rubbish. The next one's a very different collection, I think. Did you think it was different? So immediately, I think you look at it's a couple of days worth of rubbish, perhaps 3 or 4 days. Again, mixed diet, a cat again. But if you look carefully, there's actually no evidence of any meat at all. And although that might simply mean that the meat had come in packaging that doesn't survive, in this case, this is a vegetarian family. And they're also a family with a young child. It's actually a child of about 2.5, who's into princesses and dinosaurs. And so the biscuits and some of the craft making toys reflect those sorts of interests. So it's a family that spends time doing craft activities with their child. But they're also not averse to a beer or a glass of wine or two, and a bit of a chance to relax. So the next assemblage, different again. This is a family who've got teenage children still living at home. One of them's got very into healthy eating through online influencers and is making fruit smoothies with the oat drink. They're not actually a vegetarian family, they're a fairly omnivorous family. The other daughter has been getting very into baking, hence the tin of golden syrup there. There's a whole load of bathroom stuff, shampoos and razors. That's not because someone's had a madly obsessed with showering 10 times a day. It just happens that that day someone cleared out the bathroom and bought all those empty bottles of shampoo and razors and so on downstairs to throw away. There's some food remains waiting to go out to be composted. And there's some cut-offs from a pair of jeans that had been handed down from the 15-year-old to the 13-year-old, then developed holes in the knee, at which point they decided to cut them off and turn them into shorts. So again, you can see something about the family there. Next assemblage, different again. I don't know what you thought of this. This is a student household, so it's a shared flat between 3 students who are kind of in their first year at university and by the looks of it, just enjoying that freedom to decide exactly what you're going to eat, exactly what you want to drink, and exactly what you want to do with your time. So it's not the healthiest diet on the planet. There's lots of pizzas, snacks, tin foods, anything that's quick and easy to make. And there's really quite a lot of booze in there as well. And a little bit of fresh cooking is about as far as it goes with burgers, probably to go with the chips or some other sort of food like that. And then there's another collection again. This is a very small collection of rubbish here. It's just 2 days worth. And this is an old chap, well into his 60s. He's living sort of on his own. He's separated from his wife because during lockdown they have different health vulnerabilities. So they've sort of split their household. They are interested in healthy living, a little bit of a heart problem, so it's decaffeinated tea there. And apparently they have a general diet, but they're trying to cut down on meat. Given the look of the packages there, I'm not sure they're making a terribly good job of that just at the moment. There's clearly a discrete single meal in each one of those collections of rubbish. Now, you probably looked through those and got some of what I was saying, and you may have come up with other insights into these families. The last one here, I wonder if you found that a little bit more difficult. It's a very small assemblage again, but there's something else that makes it very different, because it's not a British assemblage. It's actually a collection of rubbish from Russia. And what makes this difficult to interpret is that we don't know what everything is. We can look at some of the packaging. We can see there's a packet of eggs at the back there. So even if we don't know the Russian for eggs, we can think those are probably eggs. There's a carton of juice that looks fairly like the cartons of juice we get in the UK, and it's got an apple on it, so we think that's probably apple juice. There's a turquoise blue packet that could be milk, could be cream, not quite sure, it could be something else. And there's some other items that are difficult to interpret as well. Looks like it's a carton, that purple thing on the side for carrying wine, but who can tell? In fact, this is the list of objects here. And in fact, this is a collection of rubbish from a Russian archaeological team who've had to go into quarantine, into isolation during the coronavirus outbreak. The item on the left-hand side is a large lump of stone from the dig. It's not a piece of mouldy bread. So which of those did you find easiest to interpret, and which did you find the most difficult, and why? Write your thoughts down again in your booklet. Now have a think about all the rubbish you've created over the last few days. Write a list of that in your booklet on page 3. When you've written your list, then have a think about how an archaeologist would interpret that rubbish that you've created. If all of your rubbish had gone into a bag and been collected into an assemblage like the ones you've just been looking at, how would an archaeologist interpret you and your life from that? Write down what you think they'd say, and then write down how accurate you think they'd be, what might mislead them and what might be a dead giveaway. So this looking at the stuff that gets left behind is what archaeologists spend a lot of time doing. Today, most of our rubbish is taken away to be recycled or put into landfill sites, but for most people that's only been happening for a few decades. Before that, the stuff that people consumed, or broke, or didn't want anymore tended to get thrown away very, very close to where they lived. And this can, of course, provide some very useful clues to people's lives. So it's just one example. This is a small excavation in a garden of a house in a village in Essex. You can see the excavation there, it's just very small, 1 metre square. And I'm just showing you that slide of those different sorts of pottery through time to remind you that. Have another look at that and think about what fragments of stuff look like. The next slide you'll see will be some of those fragments. And you'll be needing to think about what sort of date you think they might be. Okay, so if you've had a chance to have a look at that. So here are some of the finds from this excavation. There were a lot, because this 1 metre square by sheer fluke came down on a rubbish pit. So it was entirely filled with rubbish. Here is some of the pottery that's been photographed here. So have a look at that and see what date you think it might be. And here's some of the other finds. A lot of glass, including some complete bottles, as you can see, and plenty of other broken bottles, all sorts of shapes and sizes. So I'll leave you with this picture to look at for a little while. You've got a bit of a feel for the sort of stuff that's coming up there. What sort of date do you think this is? And again, those same questions. What sort of family, what sort of household do you think we're talking about? What can you tell about that household from looking at those fragments that you can see? And I'll just highlight a few there that are worth having a look at. Those specific items will give you some quite strong clues. Okay, so you've had a chance to have a look at that. What I'm now giving you here is a list of all of those finds. So the pottery is actually all Victorian, 161 sherds of it, so you couldn't see all of them. Too many to list on this slide individually, but they included fragments of pots of Shipham's potted meat, Cunningham and Fourier's bloater paste, a marmalade pot, a face cream pot, cold cream to put on your face, some willow pattern plates, very, very popular in the Victorian period when transfer printing had first come in, so you could really mass produce really detailed pictures on your china, and the designs from the Far East, like the willow pattern story, were very popular. And those two pinkish things that I put circles around in the left hand of those two photographs, those are two fragments of a porcelain doll's head. Just go back, have another look at that. You can see those there, and in fact the lower of the two there, you can actually see the doll's ear on the side of that broken doll's head. The other finds, the glass in particular, 92 fragments of glass. On top of that, there's a glass bottle stopper. And some of those complete glass bottles as well included one which had Worcestershire sauce written on it. One had Dinnerford's magnesia, which was a sort of patent medicine, written on that. There was a small rounded medicine bottle with teaspoons written on it and markings on the edge marking out individual doses. And there was a very small complete glass perfume bottle. There was absolutely no bone in that rubbish pit, and there was absolutely no metal. In fact, the pottery and the glass were pretty much the only sorts of finds that were in there. So write down in your workbook now, what do you think that household was like? What can you say about them based on the evidence? Not going beyond it, but using it as much as you can. What do those creams and lotions and potions and shop-prepared, market-bought meats tell you? What does the imported marmalade tell you? What does the doll's head and the face cream tell you? Think also about what's missing. Again, like you did with those collections of modern rubbish, what's missing? What would you like to see that you think must have been part of their lives, which simply isn't showing in the rubbish? So I'll give you a few minutes to do that. Okay, so now you've had a chance to think about that. I think one of the things that comes across very strongly from this set of finds, it feels very much like a family collection of rubbish, very similar to the second collection we looked at, with at least one little girl living in the household and parents of both genders. We've got the cold cream for the mum and there's other sort of pots that suggest might have been a man there as well, sort of shaving cream. And we've also got a lot of medicines. So we've got perhaps a bit of an anxiety about health. We've certainly got a family with enough money to go out and buy medicine, which wasn't cheap in those days and wasn't provided on the National Health Service. And it's also a family with enough money to go out and buy nice sort of shop prepared preserved treats like the potted meat, the bloater paste, sort of like fish paste to put on your toast. So we've got quite a comfortable, even possibly affluent family. They can afford to buy a beautiful porcelain doll, and those again are expensive, for their little girl, but with an anxiety about health. Now, we don't know anything else about their diet apart from what we can see from those pots, though of course marmalade would have been imported at the very least from Spain and possibly from further away. There's no bone. That doesn't mean they're a vegetarian, which was very unusual then. It's more likely to mean they were putting the bones somewhere else, and it may even have been collected by a sort of rag and bone man coming around. We do know from all those pots, though, because we see lots of examples of those, that all of those sort of products and those patent medicines all date to the 1880s and 1890s. So what we could do is go to the census, the records of who was living everywhere, which is collected every 10 years and has been since 1801. We could go to the census and see what the family were like there. We'd be able to find out perhaps if they had other children. Maybe there's a boy child whose toys aren't present in that assemblage. Maybe it was their only child. But what we won't be able to find out is that they cared about them enough to buy toys, that they bought medicines to try and keep them healthy, and were concerned with their appearance buying face creams. So rubbish in that way gets us closer to the experience of people's lives, and that's in a period that's barely 100 years ago. Part 2, we'll be looking at what rubbish can tell us about earlier periods. We'll just have a short break for now. See you in a minute. Welcome back to part 2 of Dumps the Dig. And as promised, what we're going to do is look at rubbish from an older period now. It's even more important the further back in time we get, because we don't have as much written evidence for people's lives or events or the impact that those events had on people. So here's an assemblage from another garden, the garden you saw in that previous picture. It's an East Anglian garden again, quite similar perhaps to the one we were looking at in the previous collection with that Victorian family, but the finds from this one are very, very different. So here you can see on the left-hand side there's all the pottery, and on the right-hand side there is bone. There's quite a lot of bone. A lot of it's very fragmentary and very difficult to identify, but there is some bone. Some of it can be identified. The pottery, I think, again, think back yourselves to that list you did of pottery in date order. You can see the pottery here is certainly older, apart from that one fragment on the right-hand side, which is more of that Victorian blue and white ware. When we actually list the finds here, you can see that you're absolutely right. It is older. Most of the pottery is actually early medieval sandy ware, dating to between about 1100 and 1400 AD. There's 9 sherds of that, and out of that collection of only 14 or so, that's quite a big majority. There's just 1 sherd of pottery dating to the later medieval period, the period sort of between the Black Death and Henry VIII. There's 1 sherd of German stoneware that could date to any time between about 1450 and today. There's only 1 bit of it. There's 1 bit of glazed red earthenware, dates to around about the reign of Henry VIII to just before Queen Victoria's reign, about another 250 years there. And then there's just a couple of sherds of Victorian pottery there. So most of that assemblage is medieval. And in fact, the bone is very distinctively medieval as well. There's no bone that's been sawn at all. So we can see from that we've got a medieval assemblage. And it's an interesting mix. We've got cow, we've got sheep, and then we've got some other unidentifiable species. But one of them has been gnawed by a dog or a cat. So what do you think you could infer about this household at a very different time in history? I'll just give you a couple of minutes to think about that. Just discuss it among yourselves. Okay, so just quickly having looked through this profile, well, the pottery clearly suggests there were people living here between about AD 1100 and 1350, 1400, but not much afterwards, and that suggests this particular plot may have been abandoned for a while. Their diet's quite a good one, looking at the animals. They're big sort of meat-bearing animals. You've got beef, you've got mutton. Some of those bones in both cases are meat-bearing bones, leg bones, shoulder bones for legs of beef or shoulders of beef. Probably got dairy products. If you've got cattle, you're probably using the milk and possibly from the sheep as well. And they're also cheap, nutritious shellfish. There's a little bit of oyster shell there. The family also probably farmed sheep, and we can infer this from the fact that one of the bones from the sheep is a lower leg bone. Now, there's no meat on that bone, so that suggests that the animals are being looked after at that site. They're being reared there. This isn't just joints of meat that have been bought at the market. It suggests there's a farm here. And the food remains have been thrown out. There was that gnawed bone, remember. That suggests it's been lying about on the surface. Perhaps it's just been thrown to a dog during a meal. Perhaps it's been out on a rubbish heap in the yard somewhere. It does suggest possibly that the farmyard was quite untidy. So I wonder how much of that you got. It was just a quick exercise really to jump you back in thinking about rubbish to the slightly more distant past. Because rubbish can help us explore other questions as well, like the example I'm just about to introduce you to, the Norman Conquest. Now, the site we're going to look at is a place called Mount Bures in Essex. And at Mount Bures is a very large man-made mound adjacent to the church. In the aerial photograph here, you can perhaps see just in the centre of the picture there's a sort of circular feature with some trees on top of it, just in that area there. And when you stand on the ground and look at it, this is what that mound looks like. And that going up the side is a flight of steps. So it's a very substantial, large mound. And in the aerial photograph again, just below the red circle there, the building that's immediately adjacent to the red circle is a church. So the mound and the church are very close together. Now, it's been suggested that this mound is a motte of a castle. Castles were introduced by William the Conqueror when he took over England after the Battle of Hastings in 1066. If you've done this in history, you'll remember it. If you haven't done it in history yet, then you'll enjoy it in the future. Although this Battle of Hastings and the takeover of England by William the Conqueror happened more than 1,000 years ago, we actually have a sort of record of it happening, almost like a cartoon strip in the Bayeux tapestry. It's an embroidery, and it actually shows these mounds being built. You can see in the picture on the right there's some people with their spades throwing up soil to create a mound, and you can see the half circle shaped mound at the back of the picture with a little structure on top of it, a couple of towers and a bit of fencing around it. So we can actually see these mounds being built, and I think you can see the similarity in shape between the mound on the Bayeux tapestry and the mound at Mount Bures. That said, some of these mounds have been shown to be prehistoric in origin. At Marlborough in Wiltshire, archaeologists cored down, sort of drilled a hole right down the middle of the motte there and discovered actually it was built in the prehistoric period and just rather cheaply reused in the medieval period as a castle motte. Why bother to build a new one? Put all of that effort into it if you've got a ready-made mound sitting there. In other places, excavations at places such as Abinger and Surrey have shown medieval structures on top of mounds, like the mound at Mount Bures. In the photos here, slightly blurry, rather old photograph on the right-hand side shows some large, very vertical post holes. But when you see the plan in the middle there, you can see there's a double ring of them round the edge of the top of the mound. And in the centre, there's an arrangement of square post holes. And you can see the reconstruction on the right-hand side here. So you've got the square feature is a wooden lookout post with some big solid beams holding it up, and then a little sort of room really for someone to spend their time in on top of the mound, and even on top of stilts on top of that mound with a good view over the surrounding landscape. And there's a big sturdy wooden palisade fence around the edge, as we can see from all those post holes. So there you can see those post holes, you can see how they relate to that structure in the middle. That, of course, is where that is on the reconstruction. There, again, to remind you, is the mound on the Bayeux tapestry with a picture of a structure on top of it. Not entirely clear whether it's a palisade or a fort, but it certainly looks like one of the two. And there's the post holes with that palisade. Now that's Abinger. There are lots of mottes. Some of them survive better than others. At Clare Castle in Suffolk, and that's not very far from Mount Bures, there's actually the remains of a stone building that was on top of the earthen mound there. You can see it at the back of the picture with the stone wall silhouetted against the sky. At the bottom of the picture there's one of these Motte and Bailey castles at Hallerton in Leicestershire. And you can see that has the classic layout. Although that mound at Hallerton has been ploughed almost flat, you can still see the features, the circular feature in the landscape there from the air. You can see this just from Google Earth. But all of these examples have something that Mount Bures seems to lack. The top of the picture there on the right-hand side, you can see the motte with the Bailey there. You can see at Hallerton Castle in Leicestershire, there's a circular mound, and then there's another big circle attached to it. Because what it is that Mount Bures lacks is somewhere to keep stuff. The place you kept stuff in a Motte and Bailey castle was called a bailey. It just means an enclosed area. And the reason for this is because actually if you've built a large earthen mound, there's not a lot of space on the top of it. So there's a reconstruction drawing here of what these Motte and Bailey castles look like. You can see there's a mound with a small lookout tower on top of it, steps going up to it. It's separated from the bailey by a ditch with some water in it to give it a sort of innermost defence. But then there's the outer bailey, and there's a lot more space there. And you can see how the reconstruction drawing there matches up with the features on this plan at the top. And the plan, the black and white drawing there, is from excavations that took place at a Motte and Bailey castle called Hendommen in Montgomeryshire on the Welsh border. And you can see that from the aerial photograph there. So on the plan at the back there, it's a bit difficult to see, so I've pointed a red arrow to the motte. There's the ditch separating the motte from the bailey. There's the bailey there, and there is the outer ditch protecting the whole of the motte and the bailey, making it more difficult for anyone who is trying to get in. Protects your property and stops people attacking you. And all those marks that you can see in the bailey at the top of the page, all those little blobs, are again post holes, very like those ones at Abinger on top of the motte, only this is down at the bottom in the bailey. And the reconstruction drawing from all of those posts has been done, and you can see that on the top right, and see how the whole bailey is absolutely packed with buildings. It's a really busy space because a lord who was powerful enough and wealthy enough to have a castle would have a lot of stuff he needed there. It needed to be a self-sustaining unit, so he'd have buildings for his livestock, he'd have a brewery probably, he'd have kitchens for baking, he'd have barns for storing food, he'd have a stable for his horses. everything that he needed to be within that bailey. But at Mount Bures, there is no known bailey, there's just that mound. And if there was no bailey, it wouldn't have worked as a motte. There's just not enough space to do anything on top of that motte, apart from put a couple of people in there to keep a lookout. You can't even get a source of water from it. But actually, it's been suggested that there was a bailey at Mount Bures and that it's just sort of got missed. Because when you look at that aerial photograph, you can see, and I've outlined this in red again, actually you can see the circular mound, but actually there is a feature that looks very like that motte and bailey arrangement we saw at Hallerton or at Hendomen. If I take that red off again, you can see as it without it, as it with on it. Is it possible, people have suggested, that the churchyard actually was the bailey? And the church was inside the bailey, perhaps originating as the Lord's private chapel or a church he founded under his patronage, and then later became independent and became the churchyard. This has been suggested by people some time ago. The Victoria County history, nearly 100 years ago, suggested that maybe the Norman church perhaps stood within the bailey. It also noted that the feature to the west of the site on the left-hand side actually is just the terraced garden of a later house. So that's nothing to do with the modern Bailey Castle, or the motte, if there was a bailey there. So if we're asking, was Mount Bures a castle, the first key question really is, was there a bailey? So where would you dig? Have a look at page 4 of your workbook and write down where you would put a small trench if you were trying to find out whether there was a bailey there. Do note that, of course, you're not allowed to dig in the churchyard. It's still in use for burials, therefore you can't have archaeological digs there. So the area which possibly is within the bailey, if the churchyard was the bailey and the boundary of the churchyard was the boundary of the bailey, the area that we'd really want to dig in, we can't, because it's within the churchyard. So where would you put a trench? So, have you had a chance to think about where you'd put a trench? What we did, we didn't even put a trench. We didn't have enough time, or we didn't have enough money to do a big excavation. We put one tiny test pit here, and this is the location of right on the edge of the churchyard. You can see the fence of the churchyard, you can see the church just behind the fence. So it was as close as we could get to the churchyard without actually being inside it. And it was a remarkably interesting excavation. Although it was only 1 metre square, we got some really interesting finds. So have a look at these finds, and again, remembering what you can about what pottery of different sorts of dates look like. Have a think about what you think these items might be and what they might be telling you about whether there was a bailey. And remember, the bailey is where the Lord would live and where all of their valuables would be. In case you're wondering, the reason there's a picture of a horse on there is because that's part of the story here. So we've got pottery that came from on top of the floor surface in that 1 metre square. And then we had that bone that came from the floor surface, which is actually the lower leg bone, a metatarsal of a horse. And then we had this very large sherd of pottery from inside that post hole, which is itself quite large. Does that remind you of anything you saw a bit earlier in the lecture? So here is an extra clue, because it's very difficult to identify pottery from photographs. Here's the details of the pottery. So from the floor surface, those sherds, those sort of grey-brown sherds that you saw, are all, again, early medieval sandy courseware, just like the stuff we had from that second test pit that I showed you. 11 sherds of that. That's a lot. The post hole produced pottery that was one sherd of pottery that was earlier than that, between 900 and 1100, and another 11 sherds of that early medieval sandy courseware, and the horse metatarsal and some oyster shell. So we've got a similar assemblage to that earlier medieval one, but it's also different. Some of the pottery is the same date, some of it's a bit earlier, and the animal bone's a bit different, but there are still the oysters. So have a think about what you think this might all mean. What do you think was going on here in the same way that you interpreted the evidence from those modern bags of rubbish that you looked at, or that Victorian family's rubbish? What do you suggest might have been going on here? Is there anything that suggests that this area was inside a castle bailey? Look at the finds, think about the bone. What do you think that hole inside the test pit might have been? And write your thoughts down on page 4 of your workbook. Okay, so the question I posed of you was to think about what suggests to you that this area was in a castle bailey. Now, it's really easy to look at some stuff like that and just think it's a load of broken bits or something, and I just don't know. It doesn't look like anything, and it'd be very easy not even to notice finds like that in an excavation. But actually, they're vital clues. Because the dates of those pottery, the Thetford ware that was 900 to 1100, the early medieval coursewares that are sort of 1100 to 1350, are all the point at which they overlap and come together is round about 1100, and that's just about the same time as the Norman Conquest. It's within 40 years of the Norman Conquest, so it's absolutely the right date for a modern bailey castle. And that, of course, doesn't tell you it was a modern bailey castle, it just tells you there was someone there at that time. It does tell you perhaps that it's quite a, well, there's quite a lot of pottery. Often we only find 2, 3, 4, 5 sherds from a test pit that size. So to get 22 is a big assemblage, suggests it might have been quite a wealthy place by the standards of its time. The next clue was that bone from a horse. Now, only lords would have had horses at that time. We see them on the Bayeux tapestry, they're being ridden by knights, and it's only knights really who had horses at that time. So that horse bone is a very clear indication of a lord being present. That's what makes that assemblage different to just the pottery, even with that quantity of pottery. The combination of the quantity of pottery and the horse bone is really strong. And then there's that hole. It's very like, and I expect some of you noticed, it's very like those post holes at Abinger, that circular palisade and the square feature in the middle that I showed you earlier in the talk. Very similar sort of size, very vertical sided and very deep. It's a post hole for a large timber post that would have held up either a very large building or a palisade fence, or possibly a lookout post. But it's difficult to imagine you'd put the lookout post at the bottom of the mound when you could have put it on the top of the mound. All in all, that post hole looks very much like it comes from either a lord's hall or the enclosure around a lord's residence. Exactly the sort of stuff you'd expect in a castle bailey. So on balance, this all suggests there is a high status lord's residence here. A building actually right there. Before the church was there, possibly because it's a domestic building, there's all that pottery and that horse bone. That's not a sort of collection you'd get from a church. So it makes it much more likely that there was a castle bailey here. Have a think about what more evidence you would ideally you would ideally like to prove this more strongly? Where would you dig next? Note that down on your book. Well, what we did, we didn't have a huge amount of money, and it was a community dig with members of the public like yourselves taking part in it. We only had a fixed amount of time. And actually, we only excavated that test pit several days into the dig. But immediately we found that assemblage. We realised that it was suggesting that there probably was a castle bailey there, and there's certainly a high status residence. So we put in several other test pits also around the bailey area. The one on the left-hand side you can see there is also very close to the church, although it's around the side. That produced a lot more Norman period pottery of the same date, another horse bone, and also a rabbit bone. Now, rabbits were introduced by the Normans, possibly of the Romans, but probably hadn't survived. They're certainly introduced by the Normans. So horse and rabbit are very much elite meat. They are they're elite animals. They're associated with lords rather than ordinary places. We did another test pit 11, that you can see on the right-hand side there. Again, you can just see this church in the background there. So we circled the church and the mound adjacent to it. And again, we found lots more of this pottery clustering around about 1100 AD. So we're sort of fairly confident that there is an enclosure there, there's something that would have functioned as a bailey, there's certainly somewhere there where the Lord was keeping his stuff, which is what you needed a bailey to do. But of course, the other question, the key question in our hunt to establish if Mount Bures is a castle, is was that mound fortified? You saw what the lookout tower on top of the motte at Abinger looked like. Did we have something like that on top of the mound at Mount Bures or not? So where would you have dug to try and explore that question? Again, note down your answers. So, looking to see if the motte was functioning as a sort of fortified lookout post, the obvious place to dig, of course, is on top of the motte. And we were very lucky to be able to get special permission, scheduled monument consent to do an excavation on that site because it's protected normally from excavations. Here's a picture of our trench. It's much bigger than the little test pits, as you can see, but it took up about a third of the whole of the top of that mound. It gives you a feeling for quite how small that space on top of the mound is. There's not a lot of space for a big hall and a range of buildings that the Lord would have needed to keep his stuff in, for sure. But what was that going to show us about whether the site of the mound was fortified, or indeed if it wasn't, what it was used for? And if it wasn't built by the Normans as a fortified site, what was it doing there? So here are the pottery finds from that trench. Remember the size of that trench? Remember the number of pottery sherds that came from that test pit very near the church? And have a look at think what you might infer from those. I've given you a list of what they are there. So there's 6 sherds of the early medieval sandy courseware, 2 sherds of slightly posher pottery, heading and fineware from just a little bit later, and 5 bits of the Victorian sort of white ironstone china that we looked at in that first Victorian household we looked at. So what do you think of this? How would you interpret that? Does that look like a lookout post? Does it look like there was even a residence at the top there? And then here are the other finds from the top of the mound, from this very large trench compared to the size of that 1 metre square. These are the other finds we got. So there's not very many of them. There was no bone, interestingly, no bone at all. And as you can see, there's a list of them here. So there's a lead musket ball, perhaps from the sort of earliest sort of gunpowder fired guns that come in the sort of 17th century. There's a lot of shotgun cartridges. Those are the little circular metal things with the sort of little concentric rings on them that look like little bullseyes. There's a lot of those. Those are they're used in modern shotguns if you're shooting game, like wildfowl birds. There's a couple of unidentified objects that we don't know what they are, and that does sometimes happen. There's a bit of clear, colourless container glass from a bottle, but just one piece of it. And then there's a couple of bits of clay tobacco pipe. There's a bowl and stem that you can see at the top of the picture on the left-hand side, and those two little bits of thin white pipe that you can also see in the picture on the left-hand side are clay tobacco pipe stems. So what do you think the top of this mound has been used for? Just as a little chance to have a think about this. Think about whether any of this suggests there was a fort on top, and what you think has been going on top of the mound, and at what date. Write your answers on page 4 of your workbook. So you've had a chance to think about what the top of the mound is being used for. And to sum up, that tiny little test pit by the edge of the church was the one that produced the Norman Conquest period pottery, the horsebone, and that post hole that was part of a building. So it's clearly all going on there. And remember those 22 sherds of pottery. Whereas on top of the motte, we didn't have anything like that. We had a few post holes like the ones you can see in the picture here at the top of the page. Tiny little scrapes. They're only about that deep, only a few centimetres. Might have been a bit of revetment for some kind of slightly flimsy structure. Nothing very substantial, and certainly not something that could have held a watchtower on top of it. And of course we had all those finds, bits of musket ball, bits of shotgun cartridge, clay tobacco pipe, a few bits of china. What do you think is going on? Have a final think about what you would interpret as the story of what's going on the top of that motte or mound. Interestingly, the conclusions we drew were that that mound hadn't had a structure on top of it, that it hadn't had a lookout tower. We thought perhaps it hadn't needed it. Standing on top of it, if there weren't any trees there, you get a very good view across the surrounding countryside anyway. But that of course raises the question of, well, why is it there? Why would a Norman lord go to all the trouble of building a mound like that if they weren't going to put a watchtower on it? And the answer we came up with was an interesting one based on some of the finds we had from the other trenches. So on the left-hand side of that motte, we had a couple of longer trenches, which turned up no medieval pottery at all, but they did turn up a lot of prehistoric flint that you can see pictures of in the centre of this slide at the bottom of the page, and a tiny little bit of prehistoric pottery, which is at the bottom left-hand side. Now, it doesn't look great, I absolutely grant you that, but it is a really important piece of evidence because prehistoric pottery is very, very uncommon. It's remarkable that we even spotted that, and that's because we were sieving the soil that we took out of the trenches. But this amount of prehistoric material suggests to us that maybe this mound, rather like that one at Marlborough, might actually have been built in the prehistoric period. Is it a burial mound? Is it just a ceremonial mound that was built for things to be done on top of? We don't know. We don't know if it's a burial mound. We didn't dig into the bottom, we just dug on the top. It's a lot more difficult to dig into the bottom because there's a lot of soil above you. But what we suspect is that mound was actually built in the prehistoric period, in the Bronze Age. We get a lot of mounds being built. So when the Normans arrived, that mound was already probably 2,500 years old. But it was actually perfectly suited to a Norman lord because it provided a ready-made lookout post where all the Lord had to do was establish his bailey attached onto it, and hey presto, you've got a ready-made modern bailey castle. That's just showing you the location of those prehistoric finds. They turned up on top of the mound as well. And quite a few bits of flint there too. We suspect that those few bits of medieval pottery that turned up on top of the mound may have been there actually because the mound was being used as a lookout spot, no structures, perhaps a little bit flimsy fencing around it, but probably no structures. But people were up there, maybe levelling up the surface, maybe creating, maybe they had a tent up there or something. So perhaps they're taking some bits of pottery up there, some food up there, a little bit of eating. They'd almost certainly have had somebody on lookout up there. So the story we have from the rubbish, I think, does throw some light on the process of the Norman Conquest, really. What we don't seem to have at Mount Bures is a sort of Bayeux tapestry, William the Conqueror inspired motte building going on. It looks more as if it's just a new owner moving in and kind of repurposing an existing monument. It may well have been there was a church already there near it that might itself have been attracted because the mound was there. Because it's quite possible that the mound would have been a sacred site for Anglo-Saxon people before the conversion to Christianity. So that mound has a long, long back history to it, we suspect. Right back to those original flints, through the period of lordly Norman occupation, and then, of course, into the more recent era. That collection, that Victorian family household, that's from the same village that this motte was in. They're both from Mount Bures. And it's quite possible, we've seen those bits of clay tobacco pipe there, quite possible that the family from that Victorian household would have gone for walks up to the mound, perhaps even had a picnic up there, perhaps leaving some of those broken bits of ironstone china on top of the motte. Perhaps then the gentleman would have then had a bit of fun doing some shooting up there as well. All those shotgun cartridges. So I hope that gives you some idea of the sort of way that rubbish is so important to archaeologists. It can tell us so much about both the minute details of people's lives and about the big things that happen. It can throw new light on the big stories of history. I hope you've got some idea now of how we know this evidence and how it's unique, because it's telling us about stuff, it's telling us about the intimate details of people's lives and the big picture of history that we can't get from any other source, because the Bayeux tapestry might be a good account, but it's been deliberately created. The contemporary histories of the period have been deliberately written, but rubbish is left behind accidentally. Or it's left behind on purpose. People aren't leaving it as a deliberate record of what they've done. They're not trying to present themselves or tell a story from their perspective or to make themselves look more favourable. Think about how your collection of rubbish would have, the impression that would have given an archaeologist of the future of you. Rubbish tells us stuff that we wouldn't get from any other source, and it's not biased by those same attempts at presentation the deliberately built and the deliberately written records are. So that's why rubbish is so important for understanding the past. And those things that people threw away or left behind really can be our most valuable finds. So I hope you enjoyed that dig school, and I hope to see you at another